G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's video we're going to explore non-metallic metal, or NMM, which is a technique for painting metallic looking surfaces without using any metallic themed paints like we did recently for this fella on the left. Instead we're going to try to capture the visual aspects of metal, such as its reflectiveness and the way light and shadow play across it, using just regular colours and our knowledge of light and shapes. Now many folks consider NMM an advanced technique and can find it intimidating, as it can tend to look wrong until it suddenly doesn't. But I want to show you that oils make it a whole lot more accessible, and their long working time and blending properties means we can adjust and more importantly experiment with a lot less time and effort than we could with acrylic. We'll be going for a gold armour here, using a foundational layer of Indian yellow mixed in with a bit of Dioxazine purple, as these two complements will make a nice shadow colour that we can build on. For the steel parts like the skirt and the blade, we have Indigo and Prussian blue, and Fanchon red for the weapon wrap and the plume. Titanium white is out for highlights, along with brilliant yellow pale and cadmium yellow medium to help with our gold. Asphaltum is also there for the base, and to mix in with our golds to make our shadows a bit more diverse and interesting. So let's get started. For our initial step, we've got our obligatory cheap brown craft brush that's seen far better days, and our cap of odorless thinner to help with application. The purpose of this step is to lay a foundation of colour that our subsequent layers will build on and be influenced by. We'll start with Indian yellow mixed with some purple, with a touch of thinner to make it flow better into the sculpted textures on the model. I like to start with the darker tones so that I don't have to come back in later and fill in as many shadows, and when it comes time to build on it, we'll get some free shading. I'm putting it everywhere that's going to be gold, plus a few places that aren't. Precision isn't the goal here, and any crowded elements like the skirt that are supposed to be another material can easily be changed down the line. Asphaltum makes for a solid dirt colour, but really most earth tones will do you here. In this case I need to add more thinner because of the finer textures on the base, but I'm still trying to avoid a straight up wash, as that much thinner could just as easily harm our work when it comes time to add highlights. Being a dark desaturated blue, Indigo makes a nice foundation for steel, such as the blade, and for the red elements I'm starting from purple, to create a bit more harmony with the purples in the armour. Asphaltum would also work well here, depending on the type of red that you're going for. So we'll let this sit for 10 to 15 minutes to give all that paint a chance to set and stain, before wiping away the excess. If you found you've used too much thinner at any stage, then you'll want to let it sit a bit longer to evaporate, or just wipe it all away and start over. Now that things have set, we can come in with a makeup sponge or something similar to wipe away the excess paint. This will leave behind a trace layer of paint to build on that will have also stained our mini, similar to a base coat with acrylic, only one we can actively blend into. Less is always more with oils, as it's easy to build up texture with too much paint, and we do a lot of work with very little. Using different sponges or parts of sponges for different sections will help cut down on cross-contamination, though when dealing with highly reflective surfaces like this armour, a little can be a good thing, as all those elements would be reflecting the surrounding environment after all. You could also get a sense of that free shading I was talking about a minute ago, as the sponges will leave those deepest recesses intact, and if we're intentional with our wiping, we can also leave a little more in those areas of shadow. Next we'll quickly put in some highlights down on the base, before moving on to the main event, the gold. There are a whole bunch of ways to make convincing earth tones, but here we'll keep it simple and mix a bit of white into that asphaltum with a filbert brush, and then gently start over brushing it across the base. We can really let this texture work for us here, and if we're careful the paint will catch just on the raised surfaces. It doesn't take much to get a good result, but feel free to spend as much time as you want on it. I plan on putting a couple of grass tufts down to break things up, and again the dirt really isn't the main event. For a bit of interest, I'll also mix a quick blue-grey up for the skull. It'll read as off-white, but the subtle blue versus brown contrast will make it stand out. You could also use blue to pick out some rocks in the same way. Little tricks of colour theory like this can make a big difference to our work. Now onto the gold. For me the most important part of NMM is establishing the direction of our light source. Because we're painting on the reflections, the more consistent we can make them in size, shape and angle, the more our mini will read as metal. A common criticism of the technique is that it only looks good from certain angles, and while I don't agree with that, it's certainly part of what makes it so challenging to pull off. Locking in our light source early is one way to mitigate that. So here I'm torn between it either coming from the top left or the top right. Both would catch most of the main points of interest, and both would look dramatic from the front viewing angle, so I flipped a coin and we're going with the former. So with our filbert brush loaded with some slightly darkened yellow paint, we can come in from our angle, again in gentle strokes, and let it catch where the light would fall, occasionally picking out some of the larger spots that would also catch reflected light from the ground, like the inside of the shield. Don't be afraid to go much lighter here either, as because of that foundational layer, a panel will mix and darken as it goes on, and coming in with a bigger value jump will give you an even better sense of how your metal will look with that light hitting it. We're just sketching here, getting a sense of what works, and thanks to the flexibility of oils, we're in no way locked in. And from the back I've decided to come from the opposite direction, as so much more of the model is facing that way, giving us more opportunities for interest, and having the light blocked by the shield to me would be more limiting. As we're not going to be simultaneously viewing the model from the front and back, we can cheat here in pursuit of a more interesting result, and this is one place where expression can win out over realism. The positioning of the shield allows us to further get away with this, as we can focus the bulk of the light on the front half while catching more of those edges in the back. But already I'm overcomplicating things, so just remember that it doesn't have to be perfect, and I encourage you to sacrifice a viewing angle or two that nobody's going to look from in service of the major ones, especially if you're new to the technique. Let's come in again with a brighter highlight, much the same as before, this time hitting a smaller area, giving the impression of those edges and specular highlights. I'm still sketching and using a pretty large brush at this stage, which helps with sketch mentality, but you'd be surprised with how much you can get done in oils with a larger brush. We can apply the same technique to the steel, using indigo, Prussian blue, and brilliant yellow pale instead. The skirt has a foundation of Indian yellow, meaning our blue will be muddier and less saturated, but this will give it a distinct finish compared to the blade. I'm ignoring the individual scales at this point to first block in the light. For the blade, we have a bit more creative license. Flats tend to collect light in a gradient towards one edge, and we can emphasize this by both exaggerating the gradient and by adding opposite gradients on adjacent surfaces. This light-dark-light approach is a key part of NMM, especially when dealing with an otherwise featureless surface, and the more we can capture these dramatic shifts in value, the better our result will be. Lastly, we can take a clean, dry, round brush and smooth out our blends by lightly tapping or scumbling its side against the areas that we want to work in. These early stages can result in a lot of visible brush strokes, and this method melts them away into those smooth, seamless blends that makes oil so pleasing to work with. While we're a long way from the final result, you can start to see the metallic effect take shape. And this is only after a couple of minutes of essentially overbrushing, letting the sculpt do most of the work for us, and paying attention to our shapes. If you're more comfortable with acrylic, then even going this far with oils would get you a solid roadmap in very little time, and there's nothing stopping you from letting it dry and finishing the finer details up with another medium. But we're going to keep going. Next we'll block in all the non-metallic elements like the leathers, the undersuit and the plume to give ourselves some much needed context for the rest of the mini. I'm not going to spend too long here, as NMM is the focus, and I'm using most of the same techniques I used in my TMM video, but the goal here is to knock out all the elements that aren't metal so we can see how they look against the armour, and get a better sense of what our completed mini will look like. We can achieve this with the existing colours on the palette, using red for our weapon grip and plume, highlighting up with either yellow or white, depending on how orange or pink we want our highlights to be. These parts are heavily textured, so again we can use overbrushing to let the sculpt work for us, without the chalky look that we might get using a similar technique with acrylic. Now the pendant is just some brilliant yellow pale and white added to the asphaltum, which is an easy go-to for warm parchment, and we can use that same highlight on the red if we wanted to unify things a bit more. We can make a chromatic black for the undersuit by mixing blue and brown. The yellow in place will shift it a bit towards green, but we can counter this by adjusting our ratios. I find a slightly more bluish black stands out more against the armour due to that colour contrast, and is another case where a bit of colour theory can help our individual elements to stand out. Lastly, the leathers were done with a mix of asphaltum and yellow, highlighted with brilliant yellow pale and white, with a cheeky bit of purple put into the shadows, again for harmony. Working in a focus palette like this doesn't have to be limiting, and you can get vastly different results just by altering the ratios and combinations of the same colours. If you'd like to see more of this and my other content, you can find extended and real-time footage over on my Patreon, and your support there really helps me create more videos like this one, so thanks for checking it out. Next we'll tighten up the steel before returning to the golds, and we'll also address the blue sections that we've ignored until now, like the shoulder pad and the shield facing. So far we've treated the skirt as a solid surface, but now we've got our light sketched in, we can come back and pick out the edges of the individual scales, which would be catching a lot more light than the rest. The same goes for the edges of the weapon. A liner brush is helpful here and can be used to edge highlight as well as draw on precise details. You might find that your paint isn't sticking so well by now. If that's the case, try adding a bit more thinner, as thin paint sticks over thick, and vice versa. We can trace in shadows just as easily using the same method, and, as always, our blending brush is there to help smooth out the transitions. Another trick to make your NMM more interesting is to consider reflected light, such as that from the ground on the underside of the blade. Mixing a bit of brown into the downward face of the blade not only helps sell the effect, but it also provides some strong colour contrast with the blue that we've been using so far. How much reflection you want to incorporate is up to you, and you can still get a finer result without it, but if you study the more impressive NMM works, you'll see that one thing that really helps sell the effect is the subtle shifts in colour from the sky, the ground, and the environment in general. It might look odd when you're applying it, but taking in the context of the whole model really helps it snap together. I'm going to keep this one basic. Put some red into the top of the helmet and forearm, some lighter brown into the downward facing golds, and even touches of blue into the upper planes are some ways that you could do this, and the oils let us easily incorporate such hues in a very natural way. Lastly, we can thin down some of our shadow colour to make a pin line wash, which will flow into the recesses and further boost our definition. Always test this first, as your ratio of thinner to paint will vary, but you want it just thin enough that it'll flow off your brush and do the work for you without spilling everywhere. Now if it does spill, just let it sit for 20 minutes or so before coming back to blend it in, as giving that thinner a chance to evaporate will make it far less likely to erase your work once you've disturbed it. Now we have the rest of the model established, we can return to our gold and really start pushing our NMM. Here we want to really start paying attention to the shapes of the model, as different shapes reflect light differently, and while it's generally good to study them, it's especially so with an effect like this. For example, the top of the helmet is more or less a sphere, where our highlights will be specular, radiating from a point closest to the light source. Light would also be catching on the raised areas like the nose, but we can also take some creative liberties and boost parts that we want to draw more attention to, like the rims of the eyes and the lips. While the chest has curvature, it's largely a flat plane that slopes downwards, so we can gather light towards the farthest edge, and, just as importantly, come in with an abrupt shadow just below that edge. Kujo painting has what I feel to be the definitive video on the subject, which I'll link in the description, but in short, breaking up our mini into spheres, cylinders and flats, and highlighting them appropriately helps further sell the effect. But again, we can take some license here. Her thigh guards are slightly curved, so I initially painted them as cylinders, focusing a band of light down the middle and adding some fades and bounce lights around it, but I wasn't happy with that look. Eventually I decided to treat it as a flat instead, with the light moving in a gradient from top to bottom, and I think it looks much better, even if it might not be technically correct. With oils I was able to test one approach and adapt it to another in minutes, by effectively pushing my highlights around and blending in their wake, and as a result I feel like I've really learned something while also not spending a whole bunch of time and effort. So strong abrupt highlights and shadows are what we're going for here, but it's also important to consider reflections and bounce lighting. Now this can get complicated, but generally, if you have an area in shadow angled next to another element, some of that light's going to bounce back. This is why the lines of shadow immediately below the breast are darker than the rest of that plane, as the light would be coming back into that area. Textures, scuffs, scratches, and scattered lights are other ways to sell the effect, but my goal here isn't to overwhelm you, as you could spend forever in the futzing phase like this, making adjustments and refinements. What I want to instead do is show you how easy it is to get a start on a pretty convincing NMM effect, that you can either take as is or build on with practice. Just focus on your shapes and maintaining a strong contrast between light and dark, and you're most of the way there. Next we're going to tackle the blue parts of the armour, and then come back in with some final highlights. I've left the blue details until now, as I wanted to show you a few ways to deal with differently coloured elements that are mixed in amongst others. Now the simplest thing to do would be to let it all dry and paint over it, but we can also work wet into wet. The fewer brush strokes we use, the less it'll mix, and getting the right ratio of thinner to paint will allow each stroke to cover rather than mix. But that's also tricky, and we're dealing with Indian yellow here, so let me show you the nuclear option. We can take either a cotton swab or even a brush, dip it in thinner, and wipe away the pre-glaze. Arguably it'd be better to do this earlier, but I wanted to show you that even a strong stainer like Indian yellow can be dealt with in this way. If you're using a cotton swab, then be careful about the amount of pressure that you use, as you can pull away primer like I've done on the shoulder, but don't feel like you need to scour the surface completely. Getting the bulk of the Indian yellow out of there will make all the difference between our blue going on blue or green, and a bit of residual won't be a problem, and we don't want to destroy our raised gold details if we can help it. Another case for doing this early is it'll give the thinner a chance to evaporate before we come in with our blue, but we can soak most of it up with a swab or brush and then busy ourselves with a few more touch-ups for a couple of minutes, so it doesn't really have to slow you down, especially if you're batch painting. Now that it's cleared off, we can start laying our blue down. A small brush and a bit of patience goes a long way here, especially on the shield, but I've held off on the final gold highlights, as for me at least, some slips are inevitable. For the finer recesses, we can also come in with a blue wash instead, and let that capillary action do the work for us. Now that all being said, a lot of the gold here would be taking on more of a green hue, due to all that blue light reflecting off of it, so you can always say that you meant to do it. Highlighting is fairly straightforward, using white and again paying attention to our shapes. We want a different blending brush for this, and a smaller one than what I've used would make things even easier for you. We're on the home stretch now. Next we'll tackle the shield and knock out our final highlights. While the shield is curved, it's being held somewhat perpendicular with our light source, so I want to push the highlights more dramatically by exaggerating the apex of that curve. This will also help offset the fact that we have opposing light sources front and back, as the darker back half will be more consistent with the viewing angle from the rear. So by pushing the highlights towards the front side of the middle and the shadows on the back, we can emphasize that fake edge and further sell the metallic effect. It can be tempting to put your highlights everywhere evenly, and while bouncing and scattering light gives you some latitude here, we want to be a bit more selective, saving the brightest points for the highest and most upward facing edges, and the darkest shadows for the more abrupt downward facing ones. Everything else is more flexible, and having lesser highlights where edges meet, or brighter shadows on open planes further from your viewing angle can help keep things interesting and draw the viewer's attention where you want it. And that's what I want to emphasize with this technique. While there are rules around light, shapes and volumes that can all seem too daunting to even want to try, we're still making art, both in miniature and in abstract, so don't be afraid to get creative with it. Knowing the rules gives you a better sense of what you can and can't get away with, as does good old practice, but I encourage you to really lean into how flexible and forgiving oils are, and just give it a go. Even if you just put down a pre-glaze and overbrush some initial highlights from a fixed position, you can in minutes be well on your way to a convincing effect. And again, nothing's stopping you from letting it dry and coming back later, even with another medium like acrylic, to finish off those details. So thanks very much for your company here today. I'd love to read about your own experiences with NMM, especially if you're trying it for the first time, as I feel it's one of those milestone techniques in many painters' journeys that more of us should just try. If you have any questions about the materials or techniques that I've used, or have a suggestion for another video in the future, I'd love to read about it in the comments. And consider checking out my Patreon link below, where you can access real-time footage, early access, vote on future content, and more, and the support is greatly appreciated. So again, thanks for being here, and take care.